Okay, so if you'll go into Blackboard and into this week, you're going to see there's a couple of things. Week 16, no, wishful thinking, because it would be warm outside if it were week 16. It's going to be beautiful this weekend. Okay, so week 16, or week 16, week 10. So inside week 10, week 10, week 10. So there's a couple of links if you'll scroll all the way to the bottom. So the first one we want to look at is this home Wi-Fi. And so some of this is a recap, but this is just a quick link. It was one of the questions I got a lot on the midterm. Business Wi-Fi has some different challenges, and we'll discuss those. But we talk a lot about those in our networking class. So there's a link in here from PC Magazine, and it talks about a couple of things that are pretty important when we look at Wi-Fi, especially at your house. So there's a lot of links on these pages, and I'll tell you that right up front. They have links to all different kinds of Amazon and Quill and all different kinds of places. But they have some pretty good information. So if you scroll down and read this article, so we scroll down, a couple of things. Use nothing but WPA2 or higher. If you're using WEP or WPA, there are some ways that can be broken pretty easily. WPA2, fairly robust. Default passwords. So that router, a lot of people do something very bad. Now, it's great if John decides to come into your house and he's going to fix your router. If you've not changed the default passwords, that makes his life easier to fix. But the reality is every Linksys password is admin for almost every one of their routers. So do you really want to have that hanging out there? And even worse, they don't change the name of that router. So very quickly it becomes a sea full of Linksys routers when you drive down the neighborhood or Belkin or whatever else. And it's very easy to get into those. So make sure you change the default passwords. Default password on the router. And a little later, the article talks about changing that SSID. So change the default name so it's not, Netgear or Linksys. Personally, what I like to do to scare my neighbors is I usually reference my Wi-Fi as now like drug van number 7 or something, or DEA or FBI surveillance or something like that, just to see what people are up to. Now, there's a couple of things. You can usually look on your router, and it's different depending on each router. But if you wander around a little bit, you'll be able to see what's called a device list. So you'll be able to see what devices. Now, this one's one of the newer Linksys ones. It's got the big pictures. A lot of times it's just a list. So if you have 2 computers in your house and an Xbox, then you go in on your device list and you show 12 devices connected, you might want to look at that. Some routers have guest networking. Turn that off unless you have some specific need to it. It's just inviting people to do bad things. And then the second page, why they couldn't just put this on one page. Now, here's one I'm going to disagree with. So they say in here to use what's called MAC address filtering. So who was in network class last year? Dustin? What does MAC address stand for? Come on. It's called a media access control address. And every wireless device or wired device has hard-coded in a number. So you could, in theory, get the numbers off of your laptop, that MAC address, and only allow MAC address that match to be on your network. Well, here's the problem. We'll pick on John. John, how long is it going to take you to spoof a MAC address and fake one? Well, it doesn't take very long. So it gives you a false illusion of security. Here on our college campus, and a lot of places they require you to register your MAC address of your devices. It's pretty easy to get around and work around it. So I'm going to say that that is something you don't necessarily need to worry about. On a lot of the new routers, there's a button, and it says, ooh, this Wi-Fi protected setup. You push this, and then it'll generate a code, and it'll automatically hook up your devices to it. And in theory, it's still got a code, and it's access protected, and it's got a big giant security. So there are, in fact, on that disk, that Kali Linux we looked at, there's a program called Reaver. And if you're using WPS, Reaver can break that pretty quickly. So it's billed as an easy way to make your network secure. It's not. Don't use it. Go ahead and set up manually a WPA2 password. One of the other things you may want to look at is updating that firmware. So you buy a router and you've had it for 3 years. Go out to that website for Linksys or whatever that brand is you've got. Look up the model number and see if they have updated firmware. If they do, download it, because there's now more and more exploits at the router level or the little home router level that are getting through. So make sure you get that. And almost all of these little routers have some kind of a minimal firewall. Usually they have stateful packet inspection or something. Make sure those are turned on. By default, a lot of times they're turned off, and so you might as well block just a little bit of traffic that's trying to get into your network. And there is a good caution there if you're doing something fancy. So if you have a gaming rig set up and you're connecting to Steam and you have something bizarre, you may have to look at how your routers and how it's forwarding. But that doesn't apply to about 99% of people. The last item is something called hide your SSID. That almost sounds kind of dirty, doesn't it? I'm going to hide my SSID. Well, you're not hiding anything. The reality is you can still pull up that wireless. It doesn't really gain you a whole lot. So leave it up, but make it a name that you know that's describable. So you could say, it's, Griffin's Wireless or something. Or, Drug Van 37, something like that. So that's a really quick, easy, shortcut guide that we put up there. So I go back over to the page, get rid of that and go back into Blackboard. All right, so a couple of other things. There's some PowerPoints here. We're looking at Chapter 7. Those of you that turned in the Cyber Siege, most of you went through fairly easily. There were a few people that had some issues and problems. So what I will do is, because I would really rather you go through and work on this. It's an interesting game, and there is a lot of content and information. Is we'll allow you to turn it in up till Sunday to get credit for this. So if you got stuck, email me. The one thing I notice is the errors, if it does crash, and I've had a couple of people, there are some weird things that will cause it to crash, and it's not very descriptive on the crash reports. So email me if you have an issue or if you're not able to get through something. There are a couple of assignments in here this week. So the current events assignment, we're going to talk about in class a little bit. For those of you that are here today, we're also going to look at the assignment for this week and where that's coming from. So we're going to look at something called CERT. So to set off our discussion about digital forensics and some of the things we're going to start looking at in addition to what's the content in this textbook, there is a link here. And I'm not going to play it. Yep, stop. As I say, I'm not going to play it. It starts off. So there's about a 15-minute video that gives a really quick overview about digital forensics. And I'm going to make the live students watch it here in just a minute. Kimberly, look excited. You just had this look on your face. So digital forensics is kind of an interesting side piece to some of this. So once things have broken down or there's an issue, how do we start collecting things? And again, that Kali Linux disk that we looked at actually has some forensics retrieval tools. And so we'll look at some of those from that aspect. So this week we start in looking at some new and interesting management pieces. So we've talked a little bit about the idea of benchmarking. So we have a term called due diligence. And so due diligence means, have we put in all the required effort and looked at every possible scenario that we could possibly think of? Are there still going to be things that are going to slide through our security policies? Yeah. But we make that effort, and we look at what are other companies doing. So we have both benchmarking and something we're going to call baselining. We look at what are other companies doing, what is the industry doing, what are the feds doing, and how do we make that all relevant to our own organization? And the reality is, are any two organizations exactly the same? No. And so that's one of the challenges we have, is what do we do inside of our company to make it cost effective? Because the reality is we could spend every dime our company makes and still not always stop every attack. So how do we make it cost effective? So how do we get an action that is effective for us? So we use that term due diligence. So if we end up with an issue, so we look at Target. Target goes into federal court because all these providers of services and all these cardholders come in and say, we're going to sue you now. Is Target going to say, well, we looked at this with due diligence and this could have never happened. It was unanticipated. And I think in the reality is we're going to find that that's not going to happen for Target. Partly when they started burying information and continuing to operate knowing that they were being exploited, that's going to be an issue for them. So you see a term called best standard practices. That is, what is industry-wide a best standard practice? So we talked about wireless. Is best standard practice in the industry to have an open Wi-Fi connection with no password security? No. So where does the industry or most people are they normally at? So one of the things you're going to see is something called the Federal Agency Security Project. So I would encourage you to Google it. It has a lot of information on there about standard practices at different organizations. Okay, die keyboard. And don't work. That'll make me always ever so happy. So it has everything from policies, procedures, practices from different agencies. And so you'll see in your textbook that there's a tables and all different kinds of things. But the website itself is pretty handy. And so if I come into a company and they have nothing in place, this is a great resource to start looking at policies, practices, and it deals with not just very technical aspects, but also very pragmatic and practical things, including people. How do we deal with people? And we also have to look at our organization. Are we an organization that is subject to some kind of law or standard that says how we operate. So what is one of those that we are subject to as a college? Oh. There is something that started in 1974 called FERPA, Federal Educational Rights Privacy Act. So where a lot of students see this is, I had a parent call me of their 18-year-old child, and they say, well, I'm paying the bill, I need to know what they're doing in class. And I say, you know, I'm sorry, but they haven't signed on for you to be able to receive their academic information. Now, it's got a lot of other things on it about what we can disseminate. So you'll see some forms that you've signed. So we'll pick on Sydney. So Sydney signed a form at some point saying even her athletic information could be released to newspapers. That's some long, you're like, really, I did? There's a stack. And we signed off these different types of things. So a lot of other organizations have rules and regulations. So Sarbanes-Oxley, and there's a whole ton of them. If you use credit cards, the credit card industry's got a group together called PCI. And all of those regulatory agreements have to be met. And so you have to identify what you're going to face. So there's a lot of questions, I can't even talk today, a lot of questions that you can look at. And one of them in there that I think is very telling is, can we even spend the money or the resources, because it may be personnel or it may be time, required by this recommended practice for our organization? Maybe we need to look at something to get around those. And so in the case of credit cards, is there an easy way for us to get around PCI compliance? What can I do if I'm a small organization? Can I outsource the credit card processing to get around some of those PCI compliance? Yeah. I might outsource my website. And by outsourcing it, I can sometimes maintain those security challenges, because I may spend one day a month working on a website and updating it, and I'm not cognizant of what kind of threats and targets and other things are out there. So what kind of questions and what kind of practices? So there's a ton of different places, and we're going to go look at the CERT website here in just a minute. So one of the preeminent places to study things like cyber attacks, counterintelligence, all these kinds of things is Carnegie Mellon. We've all heard of Carnegie Mellon, stuck in Pittsburgh, unfortunately, but they have one of the preeminent sites in terms of content. And so the reason we're going to go there is we're going to go look at your assignment for this week also. Yay. So NIST we've looked at. We're going to look at CERT's site. There's other ones out there, but CERT gets a ton of federal governments and grants, and they give you a lot of resources, including daily updates on different attacks. And so they've been around for over 25 years, which is a long time if you think about where we're at here. So we talk about this idea of benchmarking and looking at other companies. What are some of the downsides to that? Do you think Target is really going to put out in public everything that happened with the credit card site? Probably not. And so what happens is organizations aren't willing to always share their bad things that happen, so it keeps us from being able to learn from that. Even sometimes if we're in a company and we are their security officer, we are then bound by confidentiality rules that say, well, yeah, I know you guys got hit and you'd like to go to this conference and talk about it. We're not going to let you. And so sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. But the reality is, it's a double-edged sword. So the same tools that we use, like that Kali Linux disk, for a good purpose, we can certainly use for a bad purpose. So if we publish all the details of how Target got attacked, for example, does that then make other organizations very similar vulnerable to the similar type of attacks, because once that information is out there? So a lot of times these security journals will publish generic information and not specific. They'll try to leave out some details. You may see websites that try to get retracted, so Target has certainly tried to do damage control by trying to block websites. But we found out pretty quickly, is that information still out there? Yeah. Once it's out on the web, just like once you take those pictures on Facebook, they're hard to get rid of. So there's a lot of information. We have to realize that nobody's identical. And then this last idea, all of these targets are really a moving threat, and they move quickly. There is a tremendous amount of money, if we want to think about it in terms of organizations, and not good organizations. So people putting out viruses, threats, trying to exploit. So things that are happening in the Bitcoin world, for example, those things are happening very quickly. So those moving targets are moving very quickly. So in effect, if I say today the best standard is to use Norton antivirus on every personal computer, the reality is by next week that could be exploited, and that's not the best practice. So you have to remember that those things move very, very quickly. What happened in the past is sometimes just that. It's just the past. So we have to be aware of that. What kind of new things are going to happen? So you have this idea of something called a baseline. So it's similar to benchmarking, but we look at how do we provide a baseline comparison? In other words, where we were on a prior goal or an internal goal or a prior assessment to where we are now. So it gives us some kind of metric we can start to establish, because one of the things you're going to find, and if you're in a business program, you're going to hear this all the time, businesses run on numbers. So if you can't quantitatively say, we were 30% better than we were last year, or a very quantitative number, it's going to be hard to justify your existence. And so in the security side, we look at that. How do we create performance metrics? If you're in IT in general, how do we generate performance metrics? If you're in sales, how do I generate those performance metrics? If you're in car sales and you're not selling more cars than you did last year, are you still employed? Probably not. So that idea of creating a baseline and then working forward from that is pretty important. So there's the link to CERT, cert.org, and we're going to look at it here pretty quickly. There are a couple of things we want to look at in terms of security policies. And so a lot of these look at people, because people are usually our biggest weakness. And in fact, we're going through that as a state college system right now. They're revamping policies in terms of how often do we as employees and faculty and staff get background checked. So how often do you think we used to have to get background checked? Once a year? How about once every 5? Is that kind of frightening? Could things change in 5 years? So I believe we're moving to an every 2-year plan, but we're adding to the number of people that have to do background checks now. So anybody that interacts with students now is going to have to do background checks. So in our case, we think of students as sensitive, much like data. We want to make sure we have people that are responsible, hopefully not multiple felons. So people, do we perform background checks? Is a background check going to always reveal things? No. But is it a good safety valve to start with? So what about your employees? Have we got them enough training that they're going to recognize a security issue? So new doors. Have you guys noticed that we have new door handles in all the classrooms? Just this year. Yeah. So this was actually a security concern that's been addressed by putting these on. So for 2 reasons. One, these are now handicap accessible doorknobs. So No longer do we have the little knobs you have to turn. And they actually have a lock, so we can lock these doors while you're in here. So now we can lock you in. Now, I want to point out something interesting. And I actually had a fellow student of yours look at this and go, well, you know, here's the interesting thing. While you're locking that door, you're looking out the glass window at somebody. So what if they did manage to, and God forbid should it ever happen, that we have an active shooter incident. So you're standing here, you're locking the door, and he manages to get a shot through the glass. Well, because these door locks now override the lock, look what happens. Oh, I'm falling down. Oh, no. Yeah, and the doorknob opens. I thought that was an interesting touch that somebody looked at that. Now, the reality is I hope we're safe from those kinds of incidents, but it's happened at a lot of other college campuses. So, but we do look at those on a campus-wide basis, and that is a security threat. So what about employees? And we have had students who have had meltdowns who we don't know what's going to happen. I actually had a student a couple of years ago. I was teaching a productions operations management course. You guys ever taken, most of you have taken POM already, right? In it right now. It's a fun class. It is fun. I like quantitative things, so it's fun for me. But I have never had this happen until that day or since then. I'm reading the syllabus at the first day of class describing what we're going to do. And this guy stands up and says, I can't handle this shit, and runs out the door. And then left my office and went down into the professional study suite and had apparently a major meltdown and was actually there were many responses, including he ended up being medicated and taken off of our college campus on the first day of class. Now, as it turns out, there was a lot of other things. This particular individual had some other issues, and it kind of is unfortunate. He was actually had a lot of PSTD issues and was a returning military vet, but we didn't know anything about that. So sometimes if we have employees or people, we could work around that. But I've never had anybody panic quite like that on a syllabus. So, and no, Sydney, that doesn't mean in the fall you can panic in my class and run out the door. It won't help you. But, so what about these employees? What do we know about our employees? What do we know about these people that we're going to hire? Not only would we look at, would the typical employee know there's a security issue, but how many people do we know that just drive right on by and they see somebody breaking into a house? So how do we get employees to report this information? And who are they going to report it to? So another interesting thing that we've worked with this year at our college level is they hired a third-party company so that if we think there's any fraud or we're not following policies internally, it's like an 800 response line you can call and anonymously turn in things on our college level. Because a lot of people would be afraid if your boss was stealing reams of copy paper, what would you do? How would you work with that? So people really are one of our biggest strengths, and they're our biggest weakness. How do we deal with them? Processes. Do we look at these on an annual basis? Do we have a patch update? How many times do you think you go into a business and they haven't updated a computer since 1974? Okay, maybe that's a little bit of a hyperbole, but there are times, so how many businesses are right now being caught with, hey, I've got Windows XP, it's not going to be updated. I've only had this computer since 2004. So sometimes that in terms of policy, how do we deal with those processes of updates? You would be amazed how many things have never been updated. So what about user accounts, former employees? I've worked with a lot of places who they have former employees. If you look at their Active Directory structure, there's all kinds of people that are still there. I see it even here at our college level. So some of you may have access to our copiers for various purposes. Mr. Wessels. When you scroll through that list of people, how many of those are no longer even here? Take a look at it next time you send out a copy to somebody, because we don't always update those things. Could that be a security issue if we send out a fax to people or something that's no longer an employee here? So how do we get rid of those people? And what about technology? How do we deal with things like the internet? Do we have people that are bypassing our firewalls in our network? What about bring your own devices? Is that scary for organizations now? Has anybody heard of the term pod slurping? So when iPads and iPods first came out, they have a huge amount of storage capacity. There is software written that you can actually put on your iPad or your small device, plug it into your network, and it's called pod slurping, and it goes in and tries to retrieve all the information off, like my documents and other things. What about devices that we own and information? How do we deal with those remote devices? So we don't really want information that's out there on a laptop, that laptop gets lost or stolen. And if it does, how do we handle it? What if we're the VA contractor that had 26 million veterans records on a laptop that got lost? And we're vulnerable at places like this. What if we had an employee who, for testing purposes, decided to download the entire MyPSC database to play with it, to experiment, to check out something, put it on his home laptop, and went home and got his laptop stolen out of his car? Would that be an issue? That's not happened, thank goodness, but those kinds of things, how do we protect that information? Do we look at things in terms of, do we look at security logs on a regular basis? Do we have an intrusion detection and monitoring system in place? How do we tell? Do we have a antivirus and malware protection plan that actually actively goes out and looks at computers? Now, not in this particular lab, we're kind of isolated, but on campus, do we have those kinds of things? Do you in your company? And then one of the standards here that you're going to see is something called PCI, the payment card industry. So think about Peru. What percentage of our revenue now is generated by credit cards? How many of you paid your tuition with a credit card or a debit card? So, especially now on our online students, most of them are paying some kind of payment card. So if we weren't able to meet PCI standards and utilize credit cards on campus, could we function? So what other kinds of things are going to happen? So we look at the idea of measurements, that idea of metrics. So performance measurements. Some way to show that data. So a lot of companies have what they call digital dashboards. In other words, a one-click shop for upper management to look and see what's happening within their company. Are there security threats? Are we spending money in the right places? So generally we break it down into three things. We look at those that are determine the effectiveness of how we execute it, how we look at it where it's delivered, and then we look at those that assess if there's an incident or issue. And unfortunately, as we go forward, I think almost every company is going to have an issue. It's how do we mitigate that damage? And again, some of that is legal. How do we minimize and mitigate that damage risk and be able to document that we did that so that when we end up in court at some point, because remember, we're a very litigious society, we sue on the drop of a hat. So how do we manage to document that we had due diligence? And you see some astoundingly large judgments for some of these weird things. So does everybody remember back 3 or 4 years ago when we had the Toyota Priuses and other Toyotas with unattended acceleration? And just last week, they finally got a fine for that. And not really, the fine wasn't necessarily so much that, somebody may have died or that they had vehicles that didn't. It was because they tried to hide all those things, obfuscate them, that it became a bigger issue. $1.2 billion. If I had $1.2 billion, I could retire to the Bahamas, buy my own island. So how do we prevent our company from being the one that gets the $1.2 billion judgment? So, if you're in POM Business 335, that idea of quantifiable numbers is going to ring home again. That idea of we must have these measurements in some way that show a quantifiable, a numeric value. So we may look at averages, we may look at percentages, some kind of quantifiable data. Most people, if you say, I'm going to go into my boss and tell him I'm doing better than I did last year, and your boss says, well, I need specific numbers of why are you doing better than you? Well, I'm just doing better. So we use those numbers all the time. So even though Dustin was shaking his head about POM, I know that he goes out on the farm a lot, and we look at numbers in fields, don't we, from baseline from last year to this year. So the same kinds of things. So we need to have data that's obtainable, repeatable. So in other words, it's a process we're doing over and over again. And it really needs to be useful. We could make up numbers and just pull, you know, hey, we had 3,000 disk access last weekend. Okay, well, what does that mean? So some way that those numbers are direct and useful in terms of how do we direct resources. So NIST has 4 pieces that they think are required for an information security or cybersecurity performance to work. So we have to have strong upper-level management support. We have to have policies and procedures that are practical. In other words, they're usable and they allow the business to function. We could have a company that has no cyber intrusions if we just got rid of computers completely, but that's not necessarily practical. We have to have quantifiable numbers, so some way to measure what we're doing, and we have to have some kind of results-orientated measurement analysis. In other words, those numbers have to be aimed towards improving performance over time. They have to mean something. So if I think about here as a college, think about the same goals towards education as I think about towards performance management of InfoSec. So here at a college, you have to have strong upper-level management. Your administration, your president, your vice president have to be excited about education and be willing to work with it. And we hope that's a given. And we have to have policies and procedures that allow us to teach and to learn. So if we suddenly changed our procedures where we went an entire week straight with no break, and that was your entire class. So you were in class 12 hours a day for a week straight. Would that probably be ideal for learning? No, probably not. But so we have policies and procedures that allow us to learn. So here in our lab, we're allowed a lot more leeway than you are in a business in terms of installing software, experimenting, some kind of performance measurements. So most of you have already taken one set of CAP tests, and since Kimberly's going to graduate, she gets to take it again, don't you? You already did. So we look at measurements, so those CAP tests, when we look at Kimberly's CAP test results as a freshman and as a senior, what we're hoping for is that that shows some kind of improvement, right? Okay. As a group, then, we look at freshmen versus seniors, but those same numbers should give us some kind of performance measurement. It tells us where our students are at. And with those numbers, we then put in programs and plan things so we can try to create results. So we noticed we had issues with critical thinking, and so we tried implementing in a lot of our courses critical thinking steps, and what it's hopefully led to is an improvement on the test to verify that we really are gaining ground in that area. Because there's some interesting numbers coming out of those CAP tests. So as an open admissions university college, what does it take to attend Peru? A high school transcript? And you have to take the ACT. There's nothing that says, or the ACT or the SAT or any of those. So the scores on those CAP tests, do you think if we look at the entire university system nationwide, are we lower than average on incoming freshmen compared to freshmen at Harvard and MIT? If we look at those, probably. But yet, at graduation date on the senior side, it's kind of interesting because we are literally right at the national average for all universities and colleges, which is good. I know that you're going, well, we're average. Well, you have to look at where we start and where we end up, and average is very, very good. I mean, that takes into account, that's not just Peru State, Wayne State, that is every college and university that uses the CAP test across the country. And so it's kind of interesting. And we still have students who look at the CAP tests and Christmas tree them for whatever reason. So that's part of the reason we've then looked at how do we try to enforce them better. So the same type of thing, how do we get performance measurements that are accurate? So what do we do now to seniors to try to make people hopefully have more motivation? Is there a minimum score to actually graduate now? You're looking worried. There is. On the CAP test, yeah. So we had students, in fact, I had a student who scored well over a 30 on the ACTs coming in here as a freshman, and just because he thought it would be a funny thing to do, deliberately answered every question wrong on the CAP test as a senior, and was in the 1 percentile. In other words, 99% of everybody who took that test scored better than he did. So sometimes we have to make sure that those results are truly accurate. Is that an accurate assessment of his capabilities? No. So results-oriented measurement. In other words, those measurements have to somehow be able to be used.